Welcome to video number 1, Energy and Photosynthesis. As you admire this brilliant backdrop of water and plants, which kind of looks CG actually, just keep in mind, the world is a wonderful place. It's beautiful. So photosynthesis is one of those topics where it could get extremely complicated. We are not actually going to go into that much depth because the fact of the matter is, there are other things that we can spend time on, and we're going to choose to spend time on them. For instance, for cellular respiration, we will go into quite technical detail, especially with the Krebs cycle and so on. But today is going to be very much surface level. Don't want to get too much into it. Okay. So with that said, let's start with energy overview. We went over this in class, I know, but it does help to kind of go over it one more time, just very briefly. So we do start with the sun in any energy system that we're talking about with trophic levels, and the sun is going to release its sun rays, or sunlight, which eventually reaches a very crucial part of our ecosystem, which are the plants. So this is my plant. It's all green. Yes. And this process of taking sun energy and converting it to sugars that it uses for its own growth and eventually for consumers to feed upon is called photosynthesis. So this really is what we're going to be focusing on today. Okay. We also talked about in class that there are continuing chains we can do. So for instance, these plants are going to be eaten by primary consumers, and forgive my bad drawings. Oh, that's supposed to be a rabbit. Yeah. Oh, look at that rabbit. And these rabbits, so the primary consumer, which are herbivores, eating plants and such, are going to be eaten by secondary consumers, which in this example I will do a weird fox. Yes, that's supposed to be a fox. I know it has 3 legs. Yeah. And these carnivores are obviously carnivores because they can eat meat, going to be eventually possibly taken in by tertiary consumers. You don't always need to have tertiary consumers in a food chain like this, but in this case I am, so this is going to be my lion. That just looks like a person with long hair. Anyways, what is actually important in this entire cycle is that it is a cycle in that bacteria and fungi will actually take the remnants of all of these, right? So whenever things die, they get decomposed, and it'll recycle it back so that plants can take them in as nutrients. So in reality, we do have this sort of cycle going all the way around, with sun kind of being that external factor. So that's just a brief energy overview. Again, it's the same thing we talked about in class with decomposers, producers, and so on, and that's just it. So really quick check. What would happen if we somehow killed off all the producers, or the autotrophs, in the world? So this is where you would pause the video and excitedly answer it with any classmates you'd be watching this video with, or possibly just yourself. Okay, well, you should have said something about how the cycle of nutrients in this food chain would stop, because producers are kind of that link between the sun and everything else. Next, what would happen if the sun went out? Yes, take some time. Pause it if you need to. Well, here's the answer. The chain would fall apart again because the sun is necessary to start or kickstart photosynthesis, which kind of continues the entire chain. Interesting note: the sun is actually so far about an astronomical unit. It's an astronomical unit, AU, unit away in terms of distance, and so it actually takes 8 seconds for light to travel from the sun to here. So if the sun actually went out, we would not know that the sun went out for about 8 seconds. So in like a weird plot twist, like an M. Night Shyamalan, I can never say his name, movie, we would already be kind of dead. Yeah, well, anyways, so let's go over the photosynthesis chemical reaction. Now, the photosynthesis chemical reaction is, to be honest, something that you already covered, but I'm going to write it here, just so that you have it for reference. You have, ooh, I don't want that, actually. You have 6 CO2, or 6 carbon dioxide molecules, with 6 water molecules, Okay, gotta water those plants, becoming glucose, which has the chemical formula C6H12O6, and that very important molecule, oxygen. Now, we all know the importance of oxygen, right? We breathe oxygen. We need it for cellular respiration, later we'll find. But glucose is very important because that's going to be what primarily drives the food chain. Glucose is energy, or at least the precursor to energy that we all need to survive. And so glucose, this simple monosaccharide, if you remember from our second unit, is going to be kind of why we're doing photosynthesis in the first place. But don't forget oxygen. Oxygen is, of course, important. So just for reference, C6H12O6, I'm going to write here, is glucose. And some of you may remember that glucose is a monosaccharide, which is a monomer of polysaccharides. Okay, so let's go over that in a bit more detail now. So photosynthesis, the entire process, that chemical reaction we just looked at, can be divided into two major processes, and that is the light-dependent reactions. Oh, my handwriting is dreadful. And the light-independent reactions. Okay. So these two processes, these two reactions, will make up the entire photosynthesis reaction. And so you can actually, again, to reiterate, you can divide this 6CO2 plus 6H2O becoming glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. You can divide that entire reaction into two different steps, the light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions. One thing that might be of interest to note is actually another word for light-dependent reactions is just the light reactions. I know they got really creative. It's just the light reactions. And another word for light-independent reactions is actually what happens in the light-independent reactions, which is the Calvin cycle. Oh, yes. And so again, number one, the light-dependent reactions happen, and then number two, the light-independent reactions happen, and you'll find out that it's actually not really a sequential step where it goes 1, 2, 1, 2. It actually goes 1, 2, and it cycles back to 1, 2, and so really, you'll find it's kind of one of those, like, what came first, the chicken or the egg, in that the light-dependent reactions lead into the light-independent reactions, and the light-independent reactions will lead back into the light-dependent reactions, and so on and so forth. Key step being that the light-dependent reactions actually have light. Interesting. So, before we go into that in more detail, I am going to show you a figure for that, actually. Let's go into the anatomy of a plant cell, and so this is going to be particularly difficult with my unfortunate drawing abilities. So, let's pretend we have a leaf. Oh, look at that. Oh, so this is my leaf. Let's take a backtrack and talk about leaves. This is my leaf. And inside my leaf, right, I have plant cells. Right, and those are huge plant cells, but you get the idea. Plant cells making up my leaf. And so one of the things that I want to focus on is the plant cell itself and the structures that are inside of it. So right here, this is my plant cell. Boom, right here. This is my plant cell. First off, I have a plant cell wall. So let's actually make that. Okay, so this would be my plant cell wall, which we actually saw in those microscopes in that earlier unit. So plant cell wall. Okay, and then we have actually the cell membrane under that. So we've got the cell membrane. So the cell wall is actually covering the cell membrane. And inside we've got the large central vacuole. This would be the large central vacuole. And then we've got a nucleus. That's important. Right? And we've got the ribosomes, the endoplasmic reticuli, and everything that's important that we talked about in eukaryotic cells. But really, really important, and particular to photosynthesis, is the presence of something called a chloroplast. The chloroplast. The chloroplast. And the chloroplast is what we're going to be focusing on for the remainder of this lesson. So the chloroplast, so this is a chloroplast now. The chloroplast actually has these thin discs inside of them. Okay, and these stacks of discs, which kind of look like pancakes, each of these discs are called thylakoids. And just because they wanted to confuse high school students who are taking biology, if you actually have a stack of thylakoids, it is called a granum. I did not make these terms up, I promise. So granum, and if you have multiple granum, they're called grana, but really just, I don't, okay. The space inside, kind of like the cytoplasm of a chloroplast, the space inside right here, this is going to be called the stroma. So all of this inside, the space inside, all this right here, this is the stroma, and these are the thylakoids. And why are the thylakoids important? It's because actually they hold a very important pigment molecule called chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is actually on the membrane of the thylakoids. Yes, so if you see right here on the thin discs, on the membrane of the thylakoids, you have these chlorophyll molecules. Okay. And chlorophyll is a pigment molecule that actually gets excited by light, and it's what's going to be actually the main key player that's taking in the sunlight and transforming it to be used for its own nefarious purposes. Yes. Okay, so now that we've gone over the anatomy of a plant cell, let's focus on exactly what that means for us. But before we do that, here's a quick check. What molecules are on the thylakoid membrane? Yes, correct. The answer is a chlorophyll molecule. It's a pigment molecule. And also, where are the thylakoids in a plant cell? Take a moment. Pause it if you have to. The answer is that the thylakoids are actually in the chloroplasts, and they're floating around in the stroma of the chloroplasts. Okay. All right. So this picture is basically what I was trying to talk about with the light reactions and the light-independent reactions. But really, we're just going to be working through this picture and getting all our information from here. So we're going to start to get very familiar. Now, we can do a little bit of labeling with that horrible drawing that I did before. So if you look right here, this entire thing is the chloroplast. Okay, so this right here, this entire thing is the chloroplast inside the plant cell. So right here, this is a plant cell. We're looking at one chloroplast. Cool? Okay. Now, if you also look, let me get rid of those. If you also look right here, you can find these disc-shaped pancake-looking things. And if you remember what they're called, they are called... Yes, you got it! Thylakoids. I'm going to assume that you got it. So these are thylakoids, and if you have them in stacks, they're called granum. Or multiple stacks are grana. Okay? So we are going to be focusing on the two parts, which is the light reactions, or light-dependent reactions, and the Calvin cycle, aka known as the light-independent reactions. And this will make a lot more sense once we walk through it, and you'll be like, oh, I get it now. And this right here, everything right here, this is actually photosynthesis. Okay? So I know a lot of you have already heard and learned that photosynthesis is a process of using sunlight and blah to make sugars and oxygen and so on. But we're going to go over the mechanism of how that's being done with the light reactions in the Calvin cycle today. Cool? Okay, so let's actually look at this drawing more specifically. We're going to skip that. let's actually look at this drawing more specifically in regards to the light reactions first, or also known as the light-dependent reactions. Okay, because it depends on light. Oh. Okay. Reactions, I did it with RxN because I'm too lazy to write out the whole thing. Okay, so we're going to just focus on this part right here. Okay, so don't worry about this yet. That's the Calvin cycle, or light-independent reaction. Let's just focus on what happens here. Okay. So, first off, water is going to come into the chloroplast. Okay, and the water might have come from the plants taking it in from their roots, or they might have even come through some openings in the plant cell. But either way, water comes into the chloroplast first. And so this water is actually our key component. So as water enters the chloroplast, it's actually going to be broken up by sunlight. So light, the sun, and let me take out my sun. Okay, so the sun, I don't know why it's a green sun. It's because I didn't change the color, I guess. So the sun actually, it's really interesting. It breaks apart water. So this is my water. It's like water. It breaks it apart in this process known as photolysis. It goes, and it breaks it into oxygen and hydrogen ions. Okay? Now those hydrogen ions are going to stay hydrogen ions for long, but what's really key is that light is used to break water. So light is used to break water into oxygen and hydrogen. Cool? I just got a Facebook notification. Okay. So, in the light reaction, again, in summary, in the light reaction, let me clear this up, water is being broken down into oxygen, and the hydrogen ions are going to be floating around here. In fact, they're important for this thing called NADPH, which is also formed. So what I want you to take away is, in the light reactions, the very first step of photosynthesis, water is coming in, light is coming in, and this thing called NADPH, which is actually an electron carrier, electrons is in those negatively charged particles inside atoms, right? Which is an electron carrier, and ATP is made. Okay? So right now, in your notes or something, you should write, for light reactions, what goes in and what goes out. So, one more time, light and water go into the light reactions. See, light and water is going into the light reaction. Light and water is going into the reactions. And what's going out is oxygen, NADPH, and don't worry if you're like, what's NADPH? We'll go over that in just a second. And ATP. So you do have to know that in the light reactions of photosynthesis, light and water are going in, and oxygen, NADPH, and ATP is being made. And these two things are going to be super important for the next step, which is the Calvin cycle. They're actually going to feed in. So let's take a step back, and let's talk about actually what is ATP, right, and what is NADPH. Okay. This is actually we're going to go into much more detail when we do cellular respiration, but I'm going to give you a brief kind of asterisk first. So, ATP, that's supposed to be a T, ATP is an energy molecule that allows the cell to do work. Okay, so one more time, ATP is an energy molecule that allows the cell to do work. On the other hand, NADPH is an electron, this is electron carrier that brings electrons, I'm going to write sideways, to other molecules. Okay, and the actual process of electrons being transferred is part of oxidation reduction, and again, that's something we're going to cover more in cellular respiration. For now, the big picture is, in the light reactions of photosynthesis, light is coming in, water is coming in, oxygen is being made, and NADPH and ATP are being made. Okay? So let's go to the second step of photosynthesis, which is going to be the Calvin cycle. Okay? The Calvin cycle. So in the Calvin cycle, we actually have ATP and NADPH going in to the Calvin. So this is a Calvin cycle. So we have ATP, NADPH, and finally carbon dioxide going into the actual Calvin cycle. Okay, so this is carbon dioxide, ATP, NADH, ATP, and NADPH, all going into the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle is this very complex step, and I'll show you guys a figure later. Again, rhoception, it can get very complicated. But the CO2, ATP, and NADPH are going to go into this thing called the Calvin cycle, spit out NADP plus and ADP, which we don't actually care about too much, except for the fact that it is reused in light reactions. But what's really important is it is in this step right here that we finally get our sugar. And this CH2O is eventually going to be combined together to make our glucose, C6H12O6, down the line. In fact, if you look at CH2O, that's actually just the simplest form of a carbohydrate, and if you multiply everything by 6, you get our glucose, or monosaccharide. So again, the in is going to be ATP, NADPH, and CO2. Our out is going to be our sugar, or aka glucose. Okay? Everything good? Yeah. Alright, so with that said, okay, try this quick check. What goes in and out of the Calvin cycle, otherwise known as the light-independent reaction? So think a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. So what goes in and out? Well, what goes in is, again, the CO2, ATP, and NADPH. Coincidentally, these two things were where it goes out of the light reactions. And what goes out of the Calvin cycle is CH2O, or the glucose, actually. And you'll be fine if you just remember the glucose. So if you kind of take a step back from all this, because it's very easy for us to just be like, oh, okay, light reaction, Calvin cycle, like, what was that? Let's just talk about what happened overview. Okay? So if we look at the net product of everything that we've done, we have water going in to the chloroplast. We also have carbon dioxide going into the chloroplast from the outside. Oh ho, guess what? In our chemical reaction, we have water and carbon dioxide going into the plant in photosynthesis. And then we finally have oxygen leaving the chloroplast and sugar leaving the chloroplast. Oh my gosh, look at that. We basically went through this photosynthesis equation. And so really, photosynthesis, the reason why I said it can be divided into two stages is because this right here, this reaction, is happening via the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. Okay, and again, light reactions is short for light-dependent reactions, and Calvin cycle is short for light-independent reactions. Something that's very important, actually, and I should write this down, something that's very important is the light-independent reactions, or the Calvin cycles, doesn't have to happen in the dark. In fact, there was a time, I believe, where some scientists used to call the Calvin cycle the dark reactions, but that was a misnomer, because Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reactions, happens all the time. The key point is that the Calvin cycle does not need light, right? So if we actually go previously to here, the Calvin cycle, there's no place in the Calvin cycle where light goes in. Light only goes into the light reactions, okay? But, again, just because you have light doesn't mean that the Calvin cycle is not working. The Calvin cycle is always going as long as it has these things, okay? So, again, it's, well, let me ask you guys. It's inaccurate to call the Calvin cycle the dark reaction because it can actually happen in the light. It just doesn't need light. If you're a little bit confused on that, don't worry, we can cover that in class later. Okay. So, let's talk about Rubisco, and to be honest, this figure is actually the Calvin cycle, and this is again, why I was so hesitant to go so complicated, or to go into more complicated parts of the Calvin cycle. But the reason why I want to mention rubisco is actually short for a very long enzyme name. I believe it's like ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate carboxylase oxidase. Like it's a very long enzyme, but we've shortened it to rubisco. And rubisco, you can see here, is an enzyme right here. It actually is what's fixing the carbon dioxide gas into an actual molecule, right? And so there was this study done by like Harvard, or like this interview of like Harvard graduates who were like, where does the sugar or the mass of trees and plants, like where does that come from? And a lot of them were like soil, like nutrient, like I don't know, like water and stuff. In reality, remember, carbon dioxide, that carbon in carbon dioxide is what's eventually going to make the carbon into carbon sugars, right? And this was done in our activity at school. And so rubisco is actually in charge of fixing this carbon in carbon dioxide to that first molecule, which is I believe it's ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate, but I could be wrong there. And so this right here is going to, oh yeah, it is. This right here is going to be really, rubisco is an enzyme that fixes that carbon in the first place. And the reason why I'm even bringing it up is because scientists estimate, or they guess, that rubisco might be the most abundant protein. Because remember, this enzyme is a protein. Rubisco might be the most abundant protein in the world. It's speculated to be the most abundant protein in the world just because almost every plant, right, at least that does photosynthesis, requires rubisco for the Calvin cycle to fix carbon. And so, I mean, and it has to do it a lot, so. Fun fact, rubisco, most abundant protein in the world. And rubisco, again, to reiterate, is the enzyme that's fixing this carbon dioxide carbon into eventually what becomes sugar. Right? So this is a sugar, goes through reaction to become this sugar, goes through reaction. Oh, I'm sorry, I should not be referring to this sugars. They should just be known as carbon intermediates. So this carbon dioxide becomes fixed into this carbon, and carbon dioxide becomes fixed to this carbon intermediate, which becomes this carbon intermediate, which becomes this carbon intermediate, which becomes this carbon intermediate, which eventually becomes this sugar, and in this sugar, glycerol 3-phosphate is combined with another glycerol 3-phosphate eventually to make glucose. You can see why I don't go into too much detail on photosynthesis. Just a lot of words, a lot of names. So, rubisco, good stuff. We can, if you want to, go into more detail. The first phase of the Calvin cycle is called carbon fixation because it's fixing carbon. The second phase is called reduction because it's actually reducing the next compound, and I'll talk about oxidation reduction later. And phase 3 is actually regeneration of the carbon dioxide acceptor, ribulose bisphosphate, which right here, ribulose bisphosphate. Here, ribulose bisphosphate is what combines with that CO2 in the first place to create that first intermediate. Okay, But I am not actually going to hold you responsible for knowing all of this. In fact, when I learned it, I made a song about it, and I realized this is so dumb. Like, why would I ever need to know this when I can just look it up? But I mean, I guess I shouldn't say that since you are going to have to memorize parts of the Krebs cycle later. Okay. Again, what I really care about is just, I don't know that rubisco is an enzyme in plant cells and stuff. I want to take a quick note with the endosymbiotic theory. The endosymbiotic theory is kind of like the origin story of how chloroplasts appeared in plant cells. A long time ago, we think that there was a bacteria, this is a bacteria, that was able to do photosynthesis. So it had P power, photosynthesis. And then there was a bigger bacteria that was like A, and it could not do photosynthesis. No P power. Okay? And what had happened was this smaller bacteria was engulfed by this bigger bacteria, and so what we ended up with was kind of this strange situation where we had this big bacteria have this smaller bacteria in it, and they were able to mutually benefit from each other in this process known as symbiosis. And so endo meaning taking in, inside, symbiosis meaning a mutual relationship, and like symbiotic relationships with parasites or mutualism. And that's kind of the first sort of bacteria that was able to do photosynthesis. Strangely enough, it turns out that we didn't have oxygen in our early atmosphere, or we predict that we didn't have, or we think, can't really say predict, that we didn't have oxygen in our early atmosphere. In fact, it was mostly reducing gases like nitrogen and hydrogen. And only after bacteria evolved the capability to do photosynthesis was oxygen produced, and that created this whole oxygen revolution where a lot of things died, because it turns out that a lot of things back then were hindered by oxygen. In fact, oxygen was toxic to them, and eventually the things that could use oxygen flourished, and boom, you have us. We'll talk about that later, though. The story of our lives. Okay, it is important to note where everything's going. So in the reactants and products of photosynthesis, our reactants are 6CO2, 12H2O, right? So these are our reactants, and an arrow to our products, which is C6H12O6, glucose, oxygen, and water. The reason why water is not usually put in the products is because we just kind of net balance and take out this 6H2O and make this into 6H2O here. But don't worry about that too much. What I really care about in this figure is where is everything going? So the water I mentioned way back earlier is broken up by photolysis, by the process of photolysis. Okay? So photolysis, is when we break this water molecule, right, into oxygen, which is released as molecular oxygen that we breathe, and this water, or this H2 or hydrogen, this H2 or hydrogen ends up going into both the sugar and the water in the products of the plant. And this oxygen from carbon dioxide is actually used to make the oxygen in water and the sugar. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I might ask you a question like, where does the oxygen from carbon dioxide end up in photosynthesis? And most people who just kind of studied photosynthesis in brief would say, oh, CO2 is like O2, so like carbon dioxide in plants becomes oxygen in plants, right? Wrong! No. The oxygen in carbon dioxide is used to make the oxygen in sugars and the oxygen in water. It's the oxygen in water in the reactant side that eventually makes the oxygen we breathe. So just something important to note. Yeah. Alright. So finishing up. This was longer than I thought. This is a very good overview, I think, of the process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration and energy. So if you see... Okay, so my dossier stopped and I'm not exactly sure where I ended. So I'm just going to start the slide again. So light energy is coming in from the sun. Yes, beautiful sun, beautiful green sun, okay. So the sun's going to come in and it's going to be helpful for doing photosynthesis. Now, just colored in everything. So in photosynthesis, we're producing sugar and oxygen, right? Which is the second part going to be used eventually. In the cellular respiration part of things in the mitochondria to make ATP, and then byproducts of that is carbon dioxide and water. And what you'll see is that the two are kind of complements of each other, where photosynthesis's products become the reactants for mitochondria and cellular respiration, and the products of cellular respiration become the reactants for photosynthesis. And so in this cyclical nature, you actually have this wonderful, sustainable model of energy. The coolest part about this also is that plants do this within themselves. So plants have chloroplasts and mitochondria, because they are eukaryotes, and what they're doing is basically they're making their own sugar, they're making their own food with chloroplasts, and the sugar in turn is being used by the mitochondria to make energy. Yes, that is energy. See that energy. To make energy, ATP, to do all the work, all the cellular work in their bodies, and then using those byproducts right here, with sunlight again, they can make more sugar and oxygen. It should be noted that not all the carbon dioxide and water actually comes from the mitochondria and feeds directly into the chloroplasts. In fact, it does get it from the outside. But I think this is a good schematic in terms of showing, like, oh, hey, like, things are, like, recycling. So, really, like, plants don't need things to eat them. although they do need the nitrifying bacteria and the nitrogen cycle provided by bacteria and decomposers. But that is a topic for another day. And so with that said, wow, that was longer than I had thought. The last final quick check question of the day is, do plant cells have mitochondria? And the answer is yes, they do, because they also need ATP. And so this is going to segue into the lab that we will do on Wednesday and Thursday, depending on when you're watching this and what period you are. And after we do the lab, we will go into cellular respiration and basics of energy. And hopefully, actually, after that, things will make a lot more sense. So with that said, please go ahead and take the Edmodo quiz. Hopefully everything is up to snuff on your lecture notes. And you have to post that either question, you have to either post a question or an answer to someone else's question on Edmodo also, but that will all be on the page. If you have any questions, please email me. And that's it. Wow, that was a long video. In the future, I will try to make the videos less than 20 minutes. I will try my best. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, and I will see you guys, in class.